Thanks for having me back. Yay, I'm so excited. So since I last saw you, I've been busy. I'm designing more patterns for you. I am always developing new lectures and classes for you. So hopefully I can keep it interesting. Thank you very much. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about me. And only because I don't like to talk about me, but I'm going to do it so that you understand that I kind of can quilt. So I have some ideas that I've been doing it for a long time, and I have some ways to streamline it for you, to make it easier for you, and hopefully you can have some fun with it. So my biography, just very quickly, I live in Graysonville, Maryland, which is just on the other side of the Bay Bridge. Yay! So I will always be loyal to the SOVAC here, and I don't care how busy I am, I'll always come back for you guys. So I started sewing, and I see a lot of familiar faces, so just bear with me while I get through this part. But I've started sewing practically when I was born. Loved it right from the beginning. Of course, started sewing like baby doll clothes and then clothes for myself. And luckily, my mother sewed, so I watched her. And it's amazing how much you pick up just from seeing it done, which I think a lot of the kids, like in the generation that followed me, their mothers didn't sew, so they didn't see it going on. And I think that's a disadvantage. And now they're starting to take the program out of the schools in some areas, the sewing program. So I'm so disappointed for that. So we have to get that next generation excited about sewing, and we have to teach them and pass it on. And I have 9 grandchildren with number 10 on the way. Yay! I thought all the stepkids were done, but no, we're getting another one, so I'm so excited about that. But I have every one of them sewing, and they all love it. Now, my stepkids, not so much, but my grandkids, absolutely, they love it. They see me doing it, and so they want to do it. But this is actually just my second career. My first career is as a landscape architect. I studied at the Pennsylvania State University, got a Bachelor of Science in Landscape Architecture, which is design. So I have some formal education in design, which I definitely think has inspired my quilting and has helped me a lot in my quilting. And I do still work full-time as a landscape architect. I mostly do work for the Delaware Department of Transportation and the Maryland State Highway Administration. So I don't really have a season because I'm not out there digging and planting this stuff. I'm just designing where it's going to go. But as far as quilting goes, I have successfully competed at national, state, and local levels. And I really encourage you to try that. It's really fun to get a little bit of feedback and to just go and see all the other pieces that are entered in the quilting categories, like at the state and local fairs. It's a lot of fun. And now I am published on the topic of quilting. The American Quilters Society published my book this year. It's called Building Blocks, and everything I know about quilting is in it. And I know that the SOVAC is carrying it, so if you're interested in purchasing that, I think it would be a good investment. And I actually, my quilt that the book was written about was on tour with the publishing company for the last year, and I just got it back. So I know this is hard to see. It's huge. It's 100 inches square. And in the quilt, I teach a lot of different techniques. I teach traditional piecing, paper piecing, applique, and the book covers everything from selecting your fabrics to binding. Oh, that'd be great, yeah. So I am so delighted to see the quilt again. It's been on tour for 3 years. Yeah, they did take very good care of it, yeah. Can we turn it so they can see it? Like go down the side? I don't know. It's sorry. I have a rack, but there's no place big enough because we're all packed in here. Thank you very much. So I had a lot of fun making the quilt and writing the book about the quilt, and I hope that you guys can partake of it. There we go. Okay. All right. So I definitely enjoy writing and designing quilt patterns. And I'm just going to go over some of my more famous quilts. This one competed at the local level and won a couple of blue ribbons. It competed at the state level and won a couple of a ribbon or so. It won the grand champion at my county fair the year that it was entered, and it won Best Mixed Technique Award at the state fair in Maryland when I entered it. So when I did this one, this is an original design, and I do have a pattern for it. So I'm very proud of that quilt. This was a quilt that I made for my brother. He is a graphic designer, so I wanted to challenge myself and make something that I thought he would appreciate as a graphic designer. He has helped me a lot developing my business cards and my stationery for my landscape architecture business. So I wanted to repay his talents with my talents. So this was the quilt that I made for him. It was accepted to show at the American Quilter Society show in Lancaster one year. It won the Best Machine Applique Award at the state fair, and it won some blue ribbons at the county fair. So I'm very proud of that one. And I was just home to see my brother in Pittsburgh not too long ago, and he actually is using it. It's on his bed, so I was very excited.
Diane,
Yes?
there are 5 of your books left outside. Is anybody interested?
And I can bring more tomorrow.
Oh, good. Do that. Wait. Hey, wait, no, I think we're okay. Up here. Uh-oh. I get 2 left.
I can bring more. I can certainly bring more tomorrow. Yeah.
All right, here's one.
So this is another quilt that has broad appeal that was very successful when I showed it. It got a first place ribbon at the county fair. Got a Judge's Choice Award at the Maryland State Fair. I am in Queen Anne's County, and I often enter the Anne Arundel County because you can enter counties that touch yours. And one year I entered, I believe it was with this quilt. Anne Arundel County Fair called me to tell me I got the grand champion. And I said, I'm sorry, but I think you need to read the ticket because I'm not in your county. I can't qualify for the grand champion. And they were so disappointed. So 10 minutes later, they called me back, and they're like, Diane, you won grand champion in the Anne Arundel County Fair. And I'm like, I just told you. And they're like, well, it was for this one. So they both would have won grand champion at the Anne Arundel County Fair as well. But I can't be a grand champion in that county because I'm from Queen Anne's County. But at any rate, it was very exciting. This quilt also, in addition to the competition that I did locally with it, it competed nationally. This was my first national competition. And this quilt came to be because I saw the Wizard of Oz fabric in the sepia tone, which is kind of like a black and white, only it's kind of like a brown and white, and absolutely loved it. The Wizard of Oz is my all-time most favorite movie ever. And they had it kitted up, like they had all these fabrics put together for you from the Wizard of Oz fabric line, and then they had made a quilt with it. But I didn't really so much very like their quilt, so I said, I got to buy this. I'll redesign the quilt myself, but I have to have this fabric. So this is what became of the fabric. It's very different than the quilt pattern that came with it. But it just so happens Fawns and Porter was having a competition in conjunction with the fabric manufacturer to see who could do neat things with this Wizard of Oz fabric, because it was the 75th anniversary of the Wizard of Oz. And I came in second place with this. And the ironic thing was I made this because I loved it, and it just so happened to fit all the parameters of the competition, and so my sisters encouraged me to enter it. So I didn't even make it thinking that, but it is one of my favorites, and it was my first national competition. So very proud of that one too. So, okay, so I hope I've gained your trust now a little bit maybe. So let's move on. Oh, here's my book, Building Blocks. So I'm a published author. And again, this book doesn't cover, it's just not a pattern for the quilt that I showed you, but it covers selecting your fabric, setting up your workstation, preparing your fabric, cutting it. It goes over basic piecing, paper piecing, raw edge applique. It goes over borders and bindings and quilting. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is actually in the book as well. So I now do not only speak locally like I am doing today, but I teach nationally now. The American Quilter Society brings me on to teach for them, and I will be teaching at the Mid-Appalachian Quilters event in July this year out in Emmitsburg. If any of you are going to be there, I will be teaching all 3 days of that event as well. So yeah, July 14, 15, 16, I think. So, and that's like a nice little getaway for you, so I strongly encourage you to consider going to that. Okay, so let me just talk to you a little bit. Today's topic is mostly going to be about what to do with your quilt once the top is done, and how to prepare it for quilting, and how to, get ideas for how to quilt it, and then the actual quilting of it. So I just want to go over some basics to start with. Needles, when I quilt, I either use a Microtex Sharp or a top stitch needle, and I usually just use a size 80, 12. Now the reason that I like the top needle, especially when I'm quilting, I like the sharps for piecing, and I like the top stitch needle for quilting. The design of a top stitch needle has a groove. Imagine if I'm a needle, it has a groove right down the center. So when that needle goes in and out of the fabric, the thread kind of is protected in the groove of that needle. So there's very little wear on the thread, so there's less breaking of the thread, and less, there's less friction because it's being protected inside that needle. So that's why I like the top stitch needle when I quilt. As far as thread goes, my favorite thread is the Aurifil thread, and they even have smaller spools than this, but this is the size that I usually buy, and I can usually piece and usually quilt with just the one spool because there's so much thread wound on there. The reason that I like the Aurifil thread is because it's thin, it's strong, has very low lint, and so you're not constantly cleaning out your bobbin area, and because it's so thin you can get a lot wound onto that bobbin, and and I know that they carry that here in the shop as well. As far as, I also will just want to, a lot of people get confused about the numbers on the thread. So the orange spool is a 50 weight, and that's a fairly thin thread. But the higher the number, the thinner the thread. But each manufacturer kind of has their own standards. So a 50 weight thread in Aurifil may not be the same thickness as a 50 weight thread in Superior, because it's all kind of specific by the brand. But in general, the higher the number, the thinner the thread. Sometimes there's I call it plastic thread, the monofilament that is supposed to be see-through, that a lot of people like to quilt with because they don't want to see the thread, but I'm going to get you over that, because after today you are going to want to see that thread. The monofilament, I think, is just a little bit more difficult to work with, and it just gives me problems, but there are times that I will use it. And then the water-soluble thread. When I'm doing trapunto, I like to do my initial stitching with the water-soluble thread. Now tension. Tension is almost the most important thing about your sewing machine. If your sewing machine doesn't have good tension, it's not worth very much, in my opinion. So if you are quilting, and a lot of times you may have to change your tension, it will probably be different from when you're piecing versus when you're quilting, because when you're quilting you're going through thicker, a lot more thickness. So a lot of times you may have to increase the tension just a little bit. At least that's what I have found for my machine. But if you're seeing, a good thing to do is take contrasting thread colors on the top and the bobbin, and on a little test sandwich, sew with and change the dimensions. So for a couple inches, change the tension. So for a couple of inches. And if you can see the bobbin thread showing up on the top as like some dots, your tension is too high or too tight, so you want to lower that number. And when I'm talking about thread tension, it's just the top thread that we're adjusting. Our bobbin thread is it is what it is for the most part. I mean, you can adjust it, but I really don't recommend it because that's set by the manufacturer, and it causes more problems, I think, if you are fussing with both the top and the bottom. So if you get the dot of thread of the top colored thread popping through to the back side, then that means that your tension is too loose or too low of a number. All right, now as far as batting goes, I like the warm and natural. I quilt all my own quilts, and I quilt them on a domestic machine. So I am manipulating that quilt an awful lot to get it to go in that small space. I also like the Dream Cotton. That is also a very good batting. They're not real lofty, but they're very stable. So they hold up under the turning and getting it through the machine. Dream, like I'm sleeping and I'm dreaming under my quilt. And then, you know, don't be afraid to play with your battings. I typically use, like the Warm and Natural, like I said, it's 87% cotton and 27 something else, I don't know. Or 12% something, whatever the math works out to be. It's 87% cotton. But there's also some, you can use like a double bat and put like a wool layer in there, and that'll make it maybe loftier, and your quilting will then look more defined. But for the most part, I just use a single layer of batting. And this is how I do it. I tape my backing to the floor with masking tape. And so this is my my formal dining room, which I have never eaten in there other than M&Ms while I'm sewing. But I just take the table out, and I have a big floor area, and I just tape the backing down to the floor, and then I spray it with a quilt basting spray. I have tried every type of way I can think of to baste my quilts. I've done the thread basting, I've done the pin basting, I've even done where you take, you know, some of your batting out and then piece it in later. I think I've tried it all. But my favorite way is with this quilt basting spray. And it's in a pink can, and it's called Sullivan's Original Quilt Basting Spray. And I know that Janice carries it. I thought I brought a can, but maybe not. It's Sullivan's Original Quilt Basting Spray, and it's in a pink can. And I think it's right around the corner, right there. It does not gum up on my machine. It doesn't collect on my needle. It holds the quilt together. You saw how big that building blocks quilt was. It was 100 inches square. I did that on my domestic machine, and I just spray basted it with the quilt basting spray. It has an odor when you're spraying it. You need to be in a well-ventilated area because it is an aerosol. But beyond that, I have not noticed it having an odor, no. So after I tape my backing down to the floor, I lightly spray it. And this Sullivan stuff is so effective, you just need a very light coating. Question?
So you spray the backing and not the batting, right?
The question is, do you spray the backing and not the batting? So as I layer it, I'm just spraying whatever layer is on top. So here I am spraying the actual fabric of the backing. Then I lay the batting on top of that, and then I spray the batting. Mm-hmm.
Hard to move once you spray it?
Is it hard to move once you spray it?
If you get it crooked.
No. If you get it crooked, no. You can just pick it up and realign it and put it down. So I will often, along this leading edge, I will often tape each layer as I put it on, just that leading edge to make sure I can get it nice and tight. But that's only if my husband's not around to help me. If he's around to help me and you got, you know, 2 people on either end, I don't even tape that leading edge. I tape the full perimeter of the backing, and I make sure that that is laying flat, taut, but not stretching it, because if your backing isn't taped down onto the floor nice and tightly, then you're just going to get puckers and wrinkles when you do start quilting. Okay, so like I said, I tape the backing, spray it, lay the batting on it, spray that, and then I lay my top on top of that. And then I let it rest for maybe 10 or 15 minutes to kind of dry. And then I pick it up off the floor very carefully, and I immediately take it to my sewing machine. And with a walking foot, I do what I like to call my foundation quilting. And all I mean by that is I pick ditches, depending on the design. Like, for example, the building blocks quilt, I just did concentric squares in the ditch following the pattern of the quilt. And what that does for you is now your quilt is sandwiched, and it's together with the quilt basting spray, and now you've done some foundation quilting. It's not going anywhere. You can fold it up, put it away, quilt it when you get to it. Because if you're anything like me, you got a couple more than one project going on at a time. So although this is ready to be sandwiched, you might not be ready to quilt it, or you might want to spend some time quilting on it, but you don't have time to finish it all. But once you get that foundation quilting in there, it's good. It's not going anywhere. And now you don't even have to start quilting in the center of your quilt. When I do my foundation quilting, I do start in the center and work my way out. But once you have that foundation quilting done, you can quilt in any order that you want because it's not going anywhere. I have a question. Can I describe foundation quilting again? Absolutely. I pick my quilt up off the floor after spray basting it all together. And I take it over to my sewing machine. And with a walking foot, I just quilt in ditches. And I like to kind of have an idea of how I'm going to quilt the overall quilt before I do my foundation quilting so that my foundation quilting isn't going to interfere with any of my designed quilting because this is quilting that I leave in the quilt. I just use a walking foot with a regular stitch length and just quilt some strategic lines in there just to stabilize it and keep all 3 layers in place. So what kind of spacing do I use in between? Typically about 12 inches because I'm usually working with 12-inch blocks. So I'll just do a grid, but it doesn't even have to be that close. Whatever kind of works with your quilt. Question? They do stick a little bit, but it's just you just use such a scant coat that it's not. And I have to say that I'm walking on this quilt because that's the backing, but once I get it sprayed, I'm kind of walking around it to the best possible. And another good thing about this is that it forces you to mop your floors because you want to have a clean floor when you put it down, and then you got to mop up all that quilt basting spray that was oversprayed. So it's just about the only time that my house gets mopped. So it's a good thing. Any more questions on the basting process? Yes? Okay, the question is what stitch length do I use? Aside from the foundation quilting, everything else is free motion. So on the foundation, I use my machine default, which is a 2.5. I don't have a baby lock, but don't tell Janice. I know. I have a Husqvarna Viking. Yeah, I know. Uh-oh. But I love it. But yeah, so I just use the default, a 2.5. And you might want to go just maybe a notch longer, if anything, because you're stitching through thicker areas. But I don't tend to do that because when I do my free motion, I don't have a regulator, so it is what it is. And they tend to be smaller stitches just because that's how it is, I guess. So I don't really make my foundation quilting stitch longer than the default. Question? Does the spray adhesive gum up the needle? Some of you may have heard this story, but the original quilt basting spray by Sullivan's, did you get the can to show? There weren't any there, okay. Okay, and the 505 is probably another good product, but I tend to be, once I find something that works for me, I kind of don't need to experiment beyond that. So I've never tried the 505, but I hear that it is good. But with the Sullivan's quilt basting spray, I have not found that it gums up the needle or the machine. It doesn't migrate down into the bobbin area at all. The most that happens is the top of the needle maybe does get a little sticky and maybe some lint will accumulate on that, and I just every once in a while just take it off. I just wipe it off the needle as I'm sewing. It's no big deal. However, it really does make a difference what spray you're using, because when my sisters first told me about this spray basting thing, because they could tell I was having such issues because I just complained every time I had to baste a quilt together because I didn't like thread basting or the pin basting. So they said, here, try spray basting. So I just went and bought any spray base that whatever Joann's Fabrics had. And it was horrible. It was horrible. It didn't hold the fabric layers together, and it did gum up the machine, the needle and all. So, but I've had very good luck with the Sullivans. Any other questions? Okay. So now, since we have our quilt top made, and it is now sandwiched and foundation quilted, what do we do with it? How do you figure out how to quilt the quilt? So I have a couple of different ways that I like to use. So one of them is I like to consider the piecework in the quilt. And I let that guide my design of the quilting. So on this quilt, believe it or not, these are squares. They're 12-inch squares. Okay, so it's 3 across and, I don't know, 6 down. But here's a square. And see all these wedges? You got how many seams coming together in that intersection there? Very, very bulky. Don't try to quilt through that. You'll be skipping stitches. You'll be getting mad. You'll be breaking threads. So just avoid it. So I picked a design that had, that did not go through that intersection. So I'm looping up here. I'm looping over here. Trying to, in the solid fabrics, I have a motif that kind of fills that whole area. But I'm avoiding the bulky areas to the greatest degree possible. I will let the quilt top speak to me, even as far as the applique. So in this quilt, I have these shapes in the applique, and then I tried to repeat those shapes in my quilting. And I often like to mix the curly quilting with the more geometric grids and lines. So I use them both. And I try to repeat. So I'm repeating the style of the applique work. I'm repeating that in my quilting. And in this particular quilt, I did trapunto. And trapunto means there's 2 layers of batting in some areas and only 1 layer of batting in other areas. So the areas that have 2 layers of batting are poofier. And that's a technical term. Sometimes I will just look at the quilt and I will read it as a whole piece. So I will just do a single design through the whole thing. And for this one, I eyeballed it. I didn't mark it, which is not like me. I usually mark everything. But I just, so I have a seam that runs this way, and I just took my quilting line and I did that, and then I did that. And then I did that on each one going in this direction. And then I turned the quilt and I did that and I did that. And that was all I did for quilting. And I did that through the whole entire quilt. So each block isn't different. It's just one big continuous design. For this quilt, it was an applique quilt. And the whole interior, I tried to make a web. Can you see that I tried to do a web? So it's an overall quilting, but I let the quilt top inspire the design of the quilting. And sometimes I will separate it and break it down into blocks and borders. So for example, on this quilt, I just did each of these setting blank blocks with a wreath, and I just stitched and ditched on the basket blocks. On this one, I did each one of these blocks the same way. You know, I did a motif here, 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 and here, and then I did some trapunto in the center. And then I took this design that I used in this block, and I repeated it in the border. And then I just used the design of the fabric to do a grid on the last border. Question?
Yes, could you spell the word trapunto?
Trapunto. It's T-R-A-P-U-N-T-O. And it's probably not in your spell check dictionary, so you're going to have to add it.
So how do you get the extra piece of batting under the trapunto?
So how do you get the extra piece of batting under the trapunto area? I have a little sample here. And while I'm looking for it, I have brochures up here on my lecture, what I lecture on, and I have some business cards so that you know how to contact me. And if you think your quilt guild would be interested in having me in to speak to them, I would be happy. Okay, so for trapunto, I mark the design of what I want a trapunto on the quilt top. And you back it up with batting. And then you sew around the perimeter. And this is where I use my Washaway thread. This is where I use my Washaway thread. I will just sew around the perimeter of the design, okay? And I just have a piece of batting behind that area that I'm sewing. And then I cut away all the excess batting, okay? So now you just have batting behind the area that you want to be poofy, okay? And then when you sandwich, as usual, you have to do this before you sandwich, yep. So then you sandwich as usual, and if you do some dense quilting around that trapunto area, it makes it even poofier. So I don't know that this is necessarily the best example of trapunto, but you can come up and look at this after class. Yes, question.
When you use washaway thread, use it only in the needle or needle and bobbin?
When I use the washaway thread, do I use it in the top and bobbin or just the top? I typically just use it in the top because I figure the underneath side, it's going to be in the batting, the layers of batting, it's not going to show. So why waste the specialty thread on the bobbin? You're welcome. Why the press and seal instead of the freezer paper? And I will go over these marking techniques in the lecture, but press and seal is just one of my favorite marking techniques because this is press and seal, and it is actually a kitchen product that we wrap our leftovers with, but it turns out it is just sticky enough to stay put on fabric wherever you put it, okay? So and it's see-through. So I just put it over top my pattern and I trace it off, and then I put it on my quilt and I just stitch right through it, and it comes off so easily. It just pops right off. So it's one of my favorite marking techniques. And even if I decide to mark it another way, a lot of times I will use the press and seal to audition designs to see if I like the way they're going to look. I'm sorry? Do I sew over the press and seal? Yep, I sew right through that. And you're welcome to come up and see, but see, I sew right over that. I know, yeah, right. She says, I have that in my kitchen. Who knew you could use it in the sewing room? Yeah, wax paper, freezer paper, and press and seal, all very good things to have in your craft room as well.
I use that to make the block and then to take it from my work area to the sewing machine so I don't lose any pieces.
Did everybody hear that? She uses this to put the pieces of her block on it because it's sticky, and where you put your fabric, that's where it's going to stay. And then you can walk around the room and you're not losing pieces all over the place. Yeah, I love press and seal. It's a great product. Okay, so I do try to repeat motifs. So if I use, like for example here, I used a star. So if I use it, I try to use it more than once, and I think that just brings some unity to the quilt. So for example, on this quilt, I did these trapuntoed feathers here with this kind of flower thing to fill that whole space. And then I took that flower thing and I repeated it in all four corners, and you can see it over here maybe a little bit better. But a lot of times if you're taking the time to do trapunto, you want to then quilt around it densely so that it pops out even more. And on this one, I just did a fairly small grid in the background of the trapuntoed feather.
So you do the trapunto first and then you put the small stippling around it, or you do this?
So do I do the trapunto first? Yes, you have to do the trapunto before you sandwich your quilt. So you have to get this part done, and then this would be your quilt top, and then you would sandwich it as usual. So can you see that when I sandwich as usual, I'm going to have 2 layers of batting here instead of just the one. So I will have one around here and then 2 where that is. So you really kind of want to look at your quilt and evaluate how you want to quilt it before you even sandwich it, because you need to know, am I going to do trapunto in there? Where do I want to put my foundation quilting lines so that they're not in the way of the overall design? So I really encourage you to spend some time with your quilt top looking at it. I will often spend days working on the design of my quilting for the quilt top before I actually dive into it. So in this quilt, I used a little feathered wreath here, and then I repeated it here as well. So I like to repeat the motifs if I can. I really like to mix the geometric and straight line quilting with the curvy line quilting. I think they really complement each other well. So on this quilt, I just did very simple lines radiating from the center of the tree. And then on the outside, I did a feathered cable. And I just think those straight geometric lines combined with the curvy cable, I just think they complement each other very well. On this quilt, again, I did some freestyle stippling, which is kind of curly, and then I did some straight line in the borders. So I think it's very effective to mix and match. Question?
I've heard people say that they might have a quilt design in their head when they start, but then the quilt starts to talk to them differently, and they change.
Right, right. So you might start out when you're piecing your quilt thinking you know how you're going to quilt it, and then it changes as the quilt evolves, and I say go with it. You know, don't be stuck, you know, don't be limiting yourself with what you thought you were going to quilt it. Once it is finished, let it talk to you and inspire you. What? Oh, it absolutely happens to me. Absolutely. I cannot tell you how many times. That's why I like the press and seal to audition, because what I thought was really going to look good in that space, yeah, kind of not so much. So I use the press and seal to audition my designs a lot. And I let the quilt hang in my cutting studio for quite a while before I commit, because I really like to let the quilt top talk to me about how it wants to be quilted. So like I said, I quilt all my own quilts, and because I'm quilting on a domestic machine, I'm often scrunching that quilt up to get it under the machine, so I can't necessarily see my whole quilt. So I typically mark everything. I'm a big marker because I can't see where I'm going, but I know if I follow this line, I'll get there. So some of my quilting friends encouraged me to go outside my box. They said, take this quilt, don't mark a thing, and see what you can do with it. So that was my challenge on this quilt. Up until this quilt, as a landscape architect, I think I was just driven toward the more muted, earthly tones. So this quilt really went outside my box. It's the bright colors, and I didn't mark a thing when I quilted it. But I still let the quilt talk to me about how it wanted to be quilted. So for this, I just stitched in the ditch of each one of these fans, and then I stitched in the center of each one of the fan blades. And then in the background, I just, a lot of us call it stippling, freestyle stippling. My mother calls it scribbling, which I think is far more descriptive. So I call it scribbling in this area. And then I did some straight line geometrics in the borders. So I didn't mark a thing, and it was a lot of fun. But I still like marking. What do I use to mark? I'm going to go over a lot of those in the program. So do you mind waiting? Okay. So when you are quilting, avoid spending a lot of time quilting in busy fabrics because it won't show. This quilt, I thought this fabric right here, that didn't look too busy to me. So I put a square feather in each one of these blocks here. But the fabric was busy because, look, you can't see that feathered square. You cannot see it. And I was so disappointed. But even that little bit of design in that fabric, you know, I really shouldn't have probably spent that much time quilting because it didn't pay off. On the back, yes. On the back, it was fabulous. So, yeah, I should just turn that one over and call it a whole cloth quilt. There you go. But you can see that if you have plain fabric with no designs on it, that the quilting will show up a lot better. And I do not even think that this is trapunto quilted. I think it's just one layer of quilting. But because it was in plain fabric, it really showed up nicely. So you want to consider the fabrics when you're selecting your designs as well. So one of my inspirations, in addition to shapes, designs, flowers, that kind of thing, I like geometry. I get a lot of use out of lines on the vertical, on the horizontal, on the diagonal. I do a lot of grids. I do a lot of straight line quilting in my borders, and especially behind my applique and behind my trapunto. I really like geometry. So this is an example of using straight lines in an evenly spaced grid, which is similar to what I did here behind the applique. Very effective. I use it a lot. Now, once I do my foundation quilting, I put my free motion foot on my machine, and I do everything else free motion. So this was done free motion. I marked it, though, and that's why it looks fairly accurate, because I marked it. Question?
Did you do the grid before you did the applique?
On this project, did I do the grid before I did the applique? No. I did my applique, and then I pieced it into my quilt top, and then I sandwiched it. So when I do a grid, when I do applique and I'm doing a grid behind it, I just am doing it free motion. So I'll just quilt along this line till I get to a piece, and then I'll just travel along the piece, and then I'll go up here, and then I'll travel along the piece and come down here. Yeah, so each piece is outlined at least once and often 2 and 3 times. And you can't see that thread build up. Maybe on the back you can a little bit, but because I like that Aurifil thread, which is fairly thin, I can go over a line several times and it doesn't really show up. Was there a question in the back? Okay. Oops, wrong way. All right, so here is an example of using lines in a grid, but now they're not evenly spaced. It's amazing that you can get such a different look. So for this, I marked one line on a 2-inch grid, and then I quilted that line, and then I quilted 1/4 inch to either side of that line. And you get a very different look than that. Similar marking, though. And then here's even a different way to use a grid. So I marked this grid, and this happened to be on a 3-inch gauge. And then I just, with my walking foot, I just quilted back and forth here, and then up and down here, and back and forth here. Now, when I'm drawing details as a landscape architect, this is called the existing ground, the undisturbed ground. That's the symbol we use. So, see, I'm using my landscape architecture to inspire my quilting. So that's another way to use a grid. Simple grid, but lots of different looks. Another way to use a grid, believe it or not, I used a grid to quilt this, is I used registration marks. So, and you can get your registration marks from the pieces of your block, or you can go in and put in registration marks. So for this, for example, I marked a line this direction, and then 2 in this direction, and this direction. And then I just kind of eyeballed it, and I knew I wanted to go through that center and hit this and come out here. And then, you know, I knew I wanted to hit this point, and I want to hit this point. So I kind of just used, I didn't draw that whole flower, I just drew the points that I wanted to hit. Okay, so then another type of quilting is freestyle. And that's where you're not marking a thing, and you just go in there and you're just winging it. I'm not a really good winger, but I do it on occasion. So this is the scribbling, as my mother calls it. And here it is represented. Just scribbling. I kind of like to, in my mind, just think of puzzle pieces, and I just kind of just wander, meander. It's also called meander quilting. Another way to think of it is loops. So for this one, I just, you know, did some loops, and then this loop, and this loop, and this loop. So these are loops. So it gives you a little bit different technique, but it's good if you're just filling in behind an area. I don't worry about going over it. So I don't want to create a lot of thread buildup, so I do try to, you know, not go over the same line a lot of times, but I'm not afraid to do that. There's no rules here. And this one is Pebbles, and for that I just, you know, just think in terms of big and little circles, and I just smush them all together in an area. And it's a good filler, and it gives you a lot of dimension. And then another filler is Swirls. And I just think in terms of S's. My maiden name is Zeckley, so I always, you know, S's has always been a big part of my life. So I just think in terms of S's, and I swirl in, and then I swirl back out, and then I do this one, and swirl in, and swirl back out. So it's all continuous, and it's just freestyling. And there's a ton of other different things that you can do freestyle-wise, but those are just a few that I'm highlighting today. So one of my favorite resources for quilting ideas is this 501 Quilting Motifs book. There are a ton of books out there to help you decide how to quilt things. So in this book, it just gives you all kinds of design ideas, and then it shows you how you can apply that to your quilt. So I really like this one, and like I said, there's a lot of them out there. So I have a lot because I just love the whole quilting thing. I just love it. Another resource is if you have EQ, which is Electric Quilt, they have computer software for the quilting designs as well as the piecing and the block designs. So now we're going to get into how do I take these beautiful designs and mark them on my quilt. There's a ton of different ways to do it. I'm going to highlight for you some of my least favorite and some of my most favorite. So this is called a Hera Marker. It's also called a point turner, okay? But if you have sandwiched your quilt, you can actually mark on it with the point of this you're just indenting the fabric because it's the batting makes it soft so that you can indent, and it actually does hold up for a pretty long time. Not my favorite though. I hardly ever use this, but I put it out there because some people do like it. You never heard of it? Okay. So there you go. I mean, you can see that line, right? So it's effective. It's just not one of my favorite methods. Another big one is these water-soluble and air erase markers. Don't like them. If you wait to mark your quilt after it's sandwiched, a lot of times this will bleed into the batting, and then it will constantly reappear, And sometimes if you happen to iron it, it won't go away. So I don't like them. I did a little test one day, and I experimented. Okay, so are these markings really going to go away? Or are they coming back on me? Or what's the deal? So the Mark the Gone, which I don't even think I have it here because I threw it out after I ran my test because it didn't go anywhere. It kept coming back, and I just didn't like. I didn't like the Mark Be Gone pen because it seemed to come back on me. The water erasable marking pen, it will come back, but only if you set it with heat. So if at any point after you mark you need to apply heat, it will tend to come back on you. The water-soluble marker by Clover, it didn't come back even when I did set it with heat. So if you're going to use one, that's probably the one I would use, this one right here. And then you also have the pens that disappear with time. And they're okay, but I don't like them because I often don't get to it in time. And the markings go away, and then I got to redo it. So these are not my favorite tools either. These are my favorite tools. They're called friction pens, and they come in all kinds of colors. And it's a pen put out by Pilot. And they did not make it as a quilting tool. So I'm just putting that out there that Pilot has a disclaimer that they are not taking responsibility if you use this on your quilting project. But I have found that the theory behind the pen is they have this plastic eraser so that you can use the pen, and then if you need to erase, the heat that builds up with the erasing will make that mark disappear. So the quilting industry has found that the heat of an iron or the heat of a dryer will also make that mark disappear. Friction. It's Friction. So it's the friction of the eraser on the paper building up heat that makes the ink disappear. If it's not too hot? If it's too hot, okay, yes. So it's sometimes people have found that it leaves residue, especially if you're marking on a dark fabric. Some people have not had good luck with it. I know that if you mark your quilt and then you put the heat on it to make the ink disappear, if you then put it in the freezer, the residue is still on there, so it will come back. And I thought, well, I'm never going to put my quilt in a freezer. That's not an issue. However, if you store your stuff in a cold attic, the markings can come back. But I have found that if I iron it again, they go away, or if I wash it and wash it out, it doesn't come back. Comment? She. Sometimes. Okay, she's saying that the ink is bleaching the fabric. So when she applies the heat, she kind of sees the color of the fabric also disappearing. I have heard that to be a problem, especially on the darker fabrics. So always, always, always test. And perhaps if you use different colors. Okay. I don't know. It could be the residue on the fabric, like the sizing on the fabric, or yeah. So you need to try it because not everybody has had as good a luck with this utensil as I have. But I do like it.
Pam Massey from Baby Lock at the retreat we had a couple weeks ago, she recommended spray starching where you're going to mark, and the spray starch would accumulate some of that color, and you shouldn't have any problem. Shouldn't have as much problem with it.
Okay, so someone is saying that they've had experience if you spray starch the area that you're going to mark with these pens, you don't have that residue kind of a problem. And that might explain why I've had good luck with it, because I always starch my fabrics before I piece with them. So that might be why. Comment? If you use the heat of a hairdryer, it can take away the markings as well. Yeah.
And I use just low heat when I iron it.
And you've had good luck with just a low heat when you iron it.
I don't put it on real hot.
Don't put it on too hot. Okay. So, you know, there's going to be pluses and minuses to this product, but I kind of like it. But again, Pilot puts out the disclaimer that this is not what they designed it for, so be careful, ladies. Another comment?
Yeah, just a question. When you say spray starch, are you using the Mary Bell or Mary Beth?
Best Press? Mary Jane's Best Press? Is that what it is? No, when I either use a fabric sizing or an actual starch, like Niagara starch. Before, you know, I think you get a more accurate cut if you have nice, crisp fabric. So I typically starch my fabric before I even cut it. Mm-hmm. Comment? You're welcome. Do I wash my fabrics? Sometimes. Typically, if I buy yardages for a quilt, then yeah, I will probably pre-wash that, and then I'll always, you know, iron it or starch it to put that sizing back in there that I just washed out. But not necessarily, like, especially if I'm using pre-cuts, like layer cakes or jelly rolls. Of course, I don't pre-wash those. Yep. But I always, if I wash it, if I do pre-wash it, I absolutely starch it before I start cutting. And I use a spray starch. Yep. I use Niagara in the aerosol. Just because, okay, that one works, so I didn't need to experiment further. So do I starch my backing? Yes, I do. Yeah, because it lays so much nicer and so much, it's just so much easier to work with. I'm sorry? Do I starch from the front or the back of my fabric? Yeah. I'm not picky. Okay, so the friction pens, it's an ink, so it just glides on your fabric. It doesn't drag your fabric as you're marking with it, and it just disappears so easily. You know, it's been my experience, and perhaps that is because I am starched before I use it. But I know Janice carries it here, but you can also find it in an office supply store because it really was and is an office supply. Comment?
It looks just like a regular pen, and I picked up the wrong one.
Yes, be very careful because it looks like a regular pen, and yeah, you can pick up the regular pen and think it's your friction pen, and absolutely, I know I have done that too. So yes, be very careful marking with it. Another reason I like the friction pen is because you can mark directly on the quilt. So you can use the geometry of the quilt and, you know, just put your straight edge right on the quilt and just draw right on the quilt. And then you can also, sometimes I use a stencil and I use the Pounce Powder with the stencil. And sometimes that powder doesn't want to stay on there as long as I need it to. So I will often go back over my Pounce Powder with the friction pen. It takes a little bit of extra time. You got to draw it all out, but it's much more stable, and that works well for me. So how do you get that design on your quilt? One method that I use is before I sandwich. If there are some light colored fabrics that aren't very busy, I throw them on a light table and use my friction pen and trace it off that way. That way I don't have anything to remove after I'm done quilting it. All I have to do is press out that ink line. So my favorite light table is my dining room table that, again, as I mentioned, I've never eaten on it. It does have the ability to separate so that you can put leaves in to make it bigger. So I just separate it, take the leaves out, and I lay a piece of glass down that, if you'll notice, my husband was kind enough to cover the edges in tape for me so that I don't kill myself. I just span it between the table, and then I put a spotlight or a lamp underneath, and that's my light table. And it's very easy to store. It's very thin. I get glass just because it's cheaper, but if you can get plexiglass. I think that's a little bit more expensive. But if you get the glass, do not lean on this glass because it will shatter. Ask me how I know. I've done it more than once. Because you just get, you know, into what you're doing and you just forget what you're dealing with here. But yeah, a lot of times I will tape my pattern to the glass and then throw my quilt top on top of that and trace it off with the friction pen. Okay, so another one of my favorite marking methods is you can use wax paper for this, but you can also use tracing paper. Being a landscape architect, I have tracing paper all the time on hand. So I just take some tracing paper, cut it down into the size of the pattern that I need. I trace my pattern on the top sheet and staple a couple, like up to 20 layers together, and then I put it in my machine and I just free motion around that design. And then I just take that piece, and now I have 20 of them, so I just tape or pin them on my quilt, and I use the lines as the guide for where I need to quilt. So I will quilt right through the paper, and then the paper just tears right off. So I like this because you draw it once, and then you needle punch it once, and you got 20 patterns. So that's good if you have a motif that keeps repeating. What do I do that with? No, I put it in my machine, and I actually, yeah, I free motion it with no thread, of course, in my bobbin or my top. Some machines won't sew if you don't have thread in them.
You just have to just hit start.
Okay, I guess I have an old-fashioned machine. I don't know, but I typically put like a bigger needle, like a 90 or a 100 needle in there, and I typically just use that for when I'm paper punching. Is paper punch paper wax paper? You can use wax paper because we all have that in our kitchens. Well, some of us do. I use tracing paper just because that's what I have, because I need it for work. I like to use paper that's a little bit see-through. Like, I won't use regular paper because when I'm placing it, I like to be able to see underneath of it so that I can place it appropriately on my quilt top. So that's the reason that I don't use regular paper. I usually just pin it where I need it to and it stays there pretty well. See, there it is. It's just pinned in place, and then I just sew along the dots. Do I set my stitches smaller to make the paper easier to rip off? And when I'm sewing this, I am free motion quilting. So I am managing the stitch length myself. And I tend to use a very small stitch anyway when I free motion. But yeah, if you're doing this and you're using your walking foot or something, if you reduce your stitch length, it will make the pattern pop off easier. Okay, so another one of my favorite methods of transferring the design, I kind of already went over, is to use the press and seal. And it's, again, a kitchen product, and it's made for sealing our leftovers, but it is just sticky enough, and I'll have it up here. It's just sticky enough that you can find your pattern, your design in your book, and I like to make a copy of it if you have the capabilities of copying that, because the stickiness will build up on the pages of the book, and then it's hard to turn the pages. So if you can, make a copy of what you want to put the press and seal on. Then I just put this right over the pattern, and then I peel it up off the pattern, and I put it right on my quilt where it needs to go. And I quilt right through that. Question?
Do you use a regular pen when you're marking the press and seal?
Okay, do I use a regular pen when I'm marking the press and seal? I used a permanent marking pen by Dritz, and it was black, and I didn't bring it with me today, because it dried quickly, and then it wasn't smearing anywhere. The Sharpies tend to not dry quick enough, so that's why I was using this permanent fabric marking pen. Dritz, D-R-I-T-Z. However, I was in a hurry the other day, and I couldn't find that pen, and I had my friction pen in my hand, so I just started using my friction pen. And the friction pen works on the press and seal. It dries quick enough, and it's stable enough that you can use oh, here's a picture of the permanent black ink pen that I typically use on my press and seal. But I just found out yesterday that you can also use your friction pen. So I just traced the pattern onto the press and seal and put the press and seal right on the quilt and quilt through it. The drawback to that is that you then do have to go back and peel that off later. So it is an extra step maybe. I also like to use the press and seal. I will lay it right on my quilt, and sometimes I will trace the seam work and then pick it up and shift it and put it down, and that gives you like an interesting kind of a technique to get some seam work. Or if you don't want to use the friction pen on your fabric, you can put the press and seal down and then just trace right on your quilt with the press and seal. Question?
No, seeing the ruler, it works really well to back the rulers and they don't slip and slide.
Oh, okay, this woman over here says the press and seal is good for backing your rulers so that they don't slip and slide when you're cutting, using them to cut with. Most of this is in my book, yes. But this is, I can't cover all of this in the book, but the highlights are in the book for sure. Another reason that I like the press and seal is that, I don't know about you guys, but I will find a design that I want to use in my border, and I will size it for the thickness, the width of my border, and then it's either too long or too short. And it's so frustrating. But with the press and seal, you can trace the pattern out onto the press and seal. And then if you can see up here, it's too long for the space that I want to cover. So I just cut it and scrunch it up, and now I can get it in that space, and I've evenly distributed that reduction in size without having to redraw the whole thing. Well, I trace the pattern onto the press and seal and see it's too big. Yes. So then I just cut it and scrunched it together, and then see now it fits.
Did you cut just to a couple?
I cut every loop so that it could, you could distribute it, and so that it still looked even and consistent. So, could you just fold it? Sure, sure. Mm-hmm. Another one of my favorite marking tools is the Pounce Powder, and I use that with pre-made stencils and with the needle punch stencils. And I just got really loud. Okay.
told me that they couldn't hear.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. All right, so here it is. The stencil that I made with the waxed paper, I used it and the Pounce pattern to transfer my design that way. If you don't like the idea of quilting through the paper, or you can use the pre-made stencils. And with the pre-made stencils, you could even use the friction pen. Will fit in those lines a lot of times. You can use the Pounce, or you can use the Hera Marker. All right, so the Hera Marker was the first product that I went over. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Is my time up? Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
I just wanted to make one quick announcement, and then I'm going to let her finish her thing. There's a red Lexus out in the parking lot that has their lights on, and they've been on since 9:30 this morning. So if anybody here is driving a red Lexus.
Okay, red Lexus with its lights on.
Okay, and then also, when you guys are ready to go eat, both of these doors are open. You can go right out there, and lunch is right out front. Okay, so have at it whenever you're done. Lunch is ready.
Okay, if anybody's hungry and wants to leave now, I will not be offended, but I do have a few more topics to cover. Okay, so now the question is, how to mark it. When do you mark it? So there are some markings that you have to do before you sandwich, like if you want a trapunto, you got to do that before you sandwich. So if you want to use a light table, you got to do that before you sandwich. And if you're using a vanishing marker, I would recommend that you do that before you sandwich so that it doesn't migrate into your batting. After you sandwich, you can use the Hera marker or the stencil and the Pounce or the friction pen, which you can use the friction pens and the press and seal anytime. It doesn't matter. But I strongly encourage you to have an idea of how you're going to quilt your quilt before you even sandwich it, so that you know the best way to mark it. All right, so this is my building blocks quilt, which you just saw earlier. A lot of the information I covered today, plus a lot more, is in the book. And it's an excellent reference, even if you don't make the quilt that the book is about. You can still learn a lot just on the techniques used in the book. And I know that Janice has some, and I will bring more tomorrow. So put an order in for her to set aside one for you. So tomorrow, I'm going to be giving a lecture on my 3 favorite blocks and my 3 favorite borders. So while you won't be sewing with me, I will be presenting to you some of my favorite shortcuts and techniques to speed up your piecing and to give you some insight into some borders. So I won't actually be sewing either, so it's all like lecture style for tomorrow.
How do you get all of that in when you've got a big quilt? How do you get that into your sewing machine?
Okay, so when I have a big quilt, how do I get that in my sewing machine? Like I said, I quilt all my quilts myself, and I do them on a domestic machine. And you saw how big this building blocks quilt is. Yeah, I'm a scruncher. I don't roll it because it tends to get too bulky. And if somebody compared it to having a telephone pole in your sewing machine trying to sew when you roll it. So I just scrunch it. And you can just really shove a lot in there if you're just scrunching it. And that's another reason why I like to mark my quilts so that I know once I get on that line, if I follow it, I'm good. Right, once you scrunch it, you don't know where you are or where you need to go. So, because you can only see, this much of it at a time. So that's why I like to mark.
And you start in the middle and work out?
Do I start in the middle and work out? I do with my foundation quilting. But then after that, nope, I quilt wherever I want because it's already stabilized and it's in place and it's not going anywhere. Question? Right. So like for the building blocks quilt, my foundation quilting was around the applique square and then around the log cabin squares and then around the quarter square triangles and then around each border. And so for that quilt, it was concentric squares. For this quilt, again, concentric squares, but if you don't want to do that, you could just do some grids this way and that way. And then I always do either in the ditch on either side of my borders. And sometimes that's enough, depending on your quilt. Some other quilts that I have patterns for and do classes for. So if you're interested in any of these, please let Ellie and Janice know so they can schedule me in to come in and teach them. This is the Chevron blocks quilt, which I have taught here before. And I've gotten a lot of feedback that a lot of ladies have made this quilt. It goes together pretty quickly. And it looks impressive, so when you give it away, people are still very impressed. This is my newest quilt, and it's called Blooming Blocks. So I'll be giving a class here on this soon, probably not till after Christmas. But it is an applique technique. It's a clip and flip technique. So the class will be making one blooming block. So you could make it into a pillow, because I'll be going over that in the class, how to make it into a pillow. Or you can make it into the full quilt.
Will we finish that one block that day?
Yes, you will finish this one block that day. This is the Mariner Star Blocks, which is paper piecing. So if any of you want to learn how to paper piece, this would be a good class to have Janice bring in. I think I have taught this here as well. This is medallion blocks, which goes over how to do raw edge machine applique. This is called concentric blocks, and it's just traditional piecing and creative ways of doing that. This one you already saw. It's called setting blocks. For this quilt, I already had these 6-inch applique pieces, and I didn't know what to do with it. So that's how this quilt came to be, because I wanted a creative setting for those applique pieces. And then this one you've already seen as well, picture blocks. Now this one, while I used the Wizard of Oz fabric, you can actually print out your own photographs and incorporate them into this setting.
Printable fabric.
I'm sorry?
Printable fabric.
Printable fabric, absolutely. So I'm just getting into the social media thing. I'm going kicking and screaming, but you can email me at Building Blocks Quilts, or you can visit me on Facebook at Building Block Quilts. Question? Clip and flip is the technique I use to get this block to bloom. It's where you clip the fabric and you expose the backside and the piece underneath to get this three-dimensional kind of. Oh, yeah, it's a fun one. Doesn't that look kind of complicated? So you're welcome to come up and look at this. It's really very easy. So it's a 4-hour class. Well, I'm not sure how long they'll have the class for, but we can finish this block in about 4 hours, depending on how many people. The class might be longer. But yeah, it's a real fun clip and flip technique. And it includes applique, because you have to applique these pieces down then. So it's a little twist to just traditional applique. It makes it a little bit more fun. Okay, any questions? So go tell Janice and Ellie how much you love me and you want to have me back. Thank you so much, ladies.